Namaste. On behalf of Indica and Indica courses, I welcome you all to today's webinar. Indica Academy aims to enable seekers through the selfless, self-framework envisioned by our founder, Sri Harikiran Vaidlamani. Indica courses is amongst one of the many centers and platforms that Indica Academy has established over the last so many years. Indica courses is a pioneering edtech platform in the domain of indigenous knowledge systems. We create and curate online courses across multiple IKS disciplines for lifelong learners who share our belief in the transformative power of timeless indigenous wisdom. We've curated more than 80 courses so far since our inception and have had more than 2,000 enrollments from across the world. Each course of ours is curated with much thought, emotion, passion, and effort. And we have started this series of overview webinars from the last few weeks. We began in October, and the intent is to provide a sample of what a particular course includes within itself so that the participants can make a more informed decision. Of course, the details of the course are all available on the course page, but creating a platform wherein the faculty gets to talk about what the course would entail, and the audience members can put forth certain questions, not just about the content, but other operational issues. That kind of is the intent, to create that kind of a space wherein, we can have that interaction with the prospective learners and the faculty and Indica courses per se. Now coming on to this particular course, which is Introduction to Western Civilization. How did this particular course come to be curated? As I said, each course of ours is curated with lots of thought and passion and effort and intellect and loads of brainstorming. So I recently finished my master's in liberal arts. I am a STEM professional. I've been in the corporate world for 2 decades almost, and I decided to transition into liberal arts. And currently now I am into social sciences full-fledged. So while studying liberal arts in a university abroad, I got to interact with a lot of texts across various themes: philosophy, political science, literature, religion and spirituality, etc. And there were often moments of reflection, wherein I would be like, this isn't how we think, or this isn't how things work at our end. But the way the texts are presented or the way the texts are taught, one would feel that that is the only view, or that is the best way to look at the world. And currently now I am in the social sciences stream, and when I look around, even insofar as policies are concerned, in terms of things like modernization, progress, development, all of these seem to be driven from a very Western civilizational perspective. And as our faculty, Dr. Edward Butler says, the success of Western powers in multiple domains in the modern era has kind of established the Western civilizational perspective as the universal one and the definitive one, as if that is the only way in which one has to look entire mankind, irrespective of all the differences, irrespective of all the diversity. There is a hegemonical position that we can see of this civilizational perspective from the West, and it's essential for us to engage with it, to understand it, because a lot of geopolitics, as we see currently unfolding even as we speak, it all seems to be stemming from that. We need to be able to understand that position. We need to understand the source of its legitimacy. We need to be able to critique it also and see what is the best possible outcome, or what is the best possible way forward for us. To create a foundation for this kind of an awareness, at Indica courses, we introduced a course on Introduction to Western Civilization in October. Few sessions are already done. We invited Dr. Butler to create a particular course content, which is based on a standard, widely assigned collection of readings, which are used to construct the Western Canon, so that the participants of the cohort can appreciate the wisdom and also understand the hazards if there are any. Today's webinar has been organized so that Dr. Butler, our faculty, can provide an overview of this particular course, so that you are able to make a more informed choice about enrollment into the course. Before I invite Dr. Butler to provide an overview, I would like to introduce him to you all. Dr. Edward P. Butler is the director of Indica Academy Center for Global, Polytheist, and Indigenous Traditions. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the New School for Social Research, New York City, for his dissertation, The Metaphysics of Polytheism and Proclus. Since then, he has pursued an ambitious research program in philosophy, theology, and the philosophy of religion, regularly publishing in academic journals, edited volumes, and devotionals. His areas of specialization include ancient Platonism, ancient Greek theology, ancient Egypt theology, and the polytheistic philosophy of religion in general. In addition to his theoretical work on polytheism, he's been a practicing devotional polytheist his entire adult life. He is an advocate for the preservation, restoration, and revival of polytheistic traditions around the globe. Before teaching the course on Introduction to Western Civilization, Dr. Butler has also taught a course on Introduction to Polytheism and a course on Trans-Civilizational Dialogues, Plato's Republic, and Vyasa's Mahabharata for us. We're delighted to also share that the course material for Introduction to Polytheism transformed into a book. And we are very certain that with the kind of exhaustive content that Dr. Butler creates, we might have another book on the anvil. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Butler to take us through an overview of the course. All yours, Dr. Butler.
Thank you, Dimple. And I'd like to thank everyone at Indica and at Indica Courses for the hard work that they do to create this platform, an exciting platform for online learning. And from my point of view, an exciting forum for the exercise of intellectual and academic freedom in general. And so with that, what I'd like to do is to share with you a lecture. The style of the course, since the idea of this is to give you a window into what taking a course like this is like, the course is lecture-based. And so without too much further ado, I'd like then to share with you an overview lecture about the goals and the basic orientation of the course itself. Sthenelus, one of the heroes of Homer's Iliad, famously proclaims, "We declare ourselves to be better men by far than our fathers," a sentiment that already in antiquity was understood in the sense of a broad sentiment against tradition, in favor of individual achievement and progress, especially in the arts and crafts. Galen, the great physician in the 2nd century CE, quotes this very passage to urge his readers to proceed to the practice of art in order to live up to it. There is indeed nothing that the Western tradition prides itself upon more than the notion that its ideology has, over the course of its history, become uniquely attuned to fostering progress, especially in science and technology, but also in the liberation of the potential of the individual, particularly where necessary, through the overturning of tradition itself. These values are held in common for the most part, even across the otherwise powerful political divides in Western society, though the proposals for how to implement them differ widely between the left and the right. The West thus presents the paradox of a tradition fundamentally opposed to tradition, one which has selected within itself and valorized precisely those elements tending in this direction. Iamblichus, a philosopher writing 1,000 years after Homer, characterizes the Greeks in general in this fashion. Quote, "The Hellenes are experimental by nature and eagerly propelled in all directions, having no proper ballast in them, and they preserve nothing which they have received from anyone else, but even this they promptly abandon and change it all." And yet, Iamblichus is himself a Syrian writing in Greek in the guise of an Egyptian priest, albeit one steeped in Platonic philosophy. There could be no better example of the international or cosmopolitan character of Hellenic civilization by his day in the 4th century CE, which was surely not unrelated to the very experimentalism and the love of innovation that he's criticizing here. This is not to say that contrary values have not also always had their place in Western thought. Hesiod, for example, not only regards Homer's princes as a generation inferior to those who came before, but also regards their descendants as inferior to them. But the notion of a decline from a golden age has in the West played its most powerful role in setting up the expectation of its return at the end of history. First in Christian eschatology, but then later in the secularized notion of an eschaton coming about entirely through human effort and through social transformation. The story of the West begins in the extreme southeastern corner of its later historical territory, and only very gradually comes to fully incorporate the rest of the peoples known today as Europeans. This is another basic element of the Western worldview, namely that it does not appeal in any crucial manner to an identity of blood or even of language. Galen, in the passage to which I referred above, goes on to state that those who set great store by their noble birth are suffering from a dearth of goods which they can call their own, and so they hit on the notion of race. They fail to understand that this nobility on which they pride themselves is like the coinage of a particular state, which only has currency with the inhabitants of that state, and to everyone else is counterfeit. Diogenes, the founder of the Cynic school of philosophy, was reportedly told by the oracle of Apollo at Delphi to, quote, debase the currency, which he took to mean undermining established values, not for its own sake, but in the name of a life more in accord with nature. The attempt to control nature, on the one hand, but also to seek a natural way of being, on the other, is a further constitutive paradox in Western identity. With the conception of nature, what exactly is natural, and whether being natural has a positive or a negative value, being subject to as much variability as its other formative components. The inflationary tendency, so to speak, to continue with the currency metaphor, of Western identity, has meant that its center has always been mobile and is as authentic when freshly minted in translation as when stored in the vaults of its original cultural articulation. This has allowed relative latecomers to Western civilization, such as the British, the Germans, or the United States, to claim that they somehow express more authentically the original spirit of Western civilization than their historical predecessors. It has also, of course, been the intellectual pretext for Western expansionism, which is based, at least in part, on the principle that through some finite process of assimilation, originally subject peoples can become equal participants in the Western project. Inherent in this project, of course, is the resistance coming from those holding the existing currency, however recently it was acquired, and the increasingly strident claims that the limit has been reached and the system about to crash, as in fact it has repeatedly done at various times in different ways and to different degrees. A kind of controlled collapse, indeed, seems to be essential to the Western project. The concept of revolution, in the political sense, is well established by the late 17th century and has also been embraced in principle across the political spectrum. Other civilizations, and older ones, have of course also found ways to incorporate the occasional necessity for radical change into their knowledge systems. But it's distinctive in the West to constantly seek to broaden the application of the term, so that there's been in the West a scientific revolution, an industrial revolution, and any number of minor and even banal uses of this term. Now, the very concept of a Western tradition or Western civilization is indisputably of recent emergence, arising chiefly as a secularization of the notion of Christendom. Christianity, once it had outlived its early expectations of a rapid end of the cosmos, and took to the exercise of worldly power in earnest, had already attempted to fashion for itself a broader foundation for its exercise of the secular power by appropriating Greek and Roman civilization, and in effect reinterpreting them as a junior partner in governance of a cosmos on probation. This required stripping away from Greek and Roman authors their own polytheistic piety, which was reinterpreted as either strictly worldly in significance to begin with, or as an anticipation of Christian revelation. This relationship of refashioning the origin in accord with the intended goal has continued, so that the beginning of Western civilization is in a certain respect never the actual beginning of anything, so much as it is a point which at some later point is regarded as the necessary foundation for something essential to the project going forward. Perhaps this is the case in any civilization, the beginning always being a story which at a certain point becomes important to tell, and in a prescribed fashion. It's surely more striking in the case of the West, however, insofar as the West is ideologically committed to the notion that its present self-understanding at any given moment is superior by definition to any that came before, and that the strata formed by successive revolutions are thus rather more marked in its case. A significant historical factor as well in this situation is the amnesia resulting from the loss of many texts which nevertheless exerted a silent influence for centuries upon other thinkers. Many highly influential authors and intellectual tendencies survive in the later intellectual history of the West only in fragments, due to the indifference or antipathy toward them of Christians who would have had to devote time and labor to their preservation. Bonfires of texts are far less common and consequential than the quiet work of what conservators have classified as the 10 agents of deterioration. We shall see, therefore, that while the story of the West begins by indisputable consensus in ancient Greece, it always must also pay its respects, so to speak, to the much older civilizations of the so-called Near East. This is, of course, in the first place, because Christianity needed to substantiate its claim to the supersession of Judaism by, in effect, backdating the checks it writes on what it rather arrogantly terms the Old Testament to the roots of the Jewish tradition in the great Mesopotamian civilizations, and to see its own reflection in them. There's more to it than this, however. Greek civilization, because it was positioned at the fringes of the much more powerful and ancient states of the Eastern Mediterranean, already had a long tradition of seeking its own origins beyond its borders. It wasn't a question of origins in an ancestral sense, but of the idea of civilization itself and its arts, which the Greeks readily acknowledged to have adopted from the Egyptians, who were the nearest center of civilization, as well as from the Western Semitic powers, who served as the conduit for the rather more distant centers of the Mesopotamian traditions. The so-called Indo-European influence, despite its etymological presence in the Greek and Latin languages, was largely forgotten by Greeks. Hence, the name Europe is Semitic, referencing the myth of Europa and her brother Cadmos. Europa, a princess of Phoenicia, or Phoenicia, that is the region of present-day Lebanon, elopes with the Hellenic god Zeus, who appears to her in the form of a magnificent bull and carries her across the sea to Crete, where she gives birth to 3 sons, Minos, Sarpedon, and Rhadamanthus, of whom it seems that one name, Minos, is Semitic in derivation, another, Sarpedon, is Indo-European, and the third, Rhadamanthus, derives from the local indigenous substrate population. Europa's brother Cadmos, who sets out in search of her, ends up founding one of Greece's most ancient cities, so-called 7-gated Thebes, as well as introducing to Greece the Phoenician alphabet, which was the source of the Greek alphabet, recognized by the Greeks themselves and hence termed Cadmean letters. Other myths, such as that of Io, serve to establish bonds between Hellenic civilization and Egypt. Origins have thus always been for the West a matter of aspiration and of selective appropriation. We can see this as well in Plato's Republic, in which the idea of autochthony, that is, of an origin directly from one's local earth, is at once recognized as an essential element of statecraft, but one which it is also perfectly acceptable to create artificially. Greece was not only at the fringes of the mighty states of the region, but also played a marginal role in the economic and political life of the region. While the island civilization of Crete, speaking an unidentified but likely non-Indo-European language, had created from the organization of mercantile networks and the production of luxury goods a palace-based economy resembling those of the Near East, only on a smaller scale, lacking their rich agricultural basis. Their successors in Aegean hegemony, the mainland Greek speakers of the later Bronze Age, the princes whom Homer would memorialize in his epics centuries later, were essentially pirates and feudal lords. These kingdoms were for the most part swept away in the turmoil of the 12th to 11th centuries BCE, and notably were replaced for the most part, not by new monarchies, or if the institution of monarchy survived, it was only by undergoing radical changes. Instead, Greek political life, after the Bronze Age and down to the Hellenistic era, was characterized by a variety of other state forms: aristocratic, oligarchic, democratic, and diverse syntheses of these. These new forms of government were perhaps better suited to the economic basis of Greek civilization, which lacked the natural or social resources for producing the grain surplus that was reliably redistributed by the powerful central administrations of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Greece was a land of small independent farmers and pastoralists, merchants and mercenaries. Its culture was not forged by legions of full-time, state-sponsored scribes and priests, but was predominantly oral, fashioned by itinerant bards and orators. Many of their cities, however, featured written laws, which were the highest source of authority, unless and until they were abrogated by force, to be reestablished in altered form after some chaotic interregnum. Here already, a contrast typical of the later history of the West presents itself. For in the absence of strong hereditary forms of authority, the authority of reason alternated with recourse to violence. The twin themes of recourse to ideals on the one hand and reduction to base material factors on the other thus run through classical Greek thought, occasionally cross-pollinating with one another. Hence, on the one hand, the rhetorical specialists known as sophists, who sharpened their skills in the law courts of the Greek city-states, taught the sons of the nobility and of wealthy merchants how to sway the opinions of the mass of people, whose power would be felt one way or another, even in systems other than the democracies characterized by public assemblies and the randomized rotating selection of magistrates. Sophists made constant reference to ideals in their speeches, but were committed to a relativism in which it was always possible to turn the weaker argument into the stronger one through rhetorical skill, a refined exercise of force. Hence, they embodied both the potential power of ideas in themselves and the craft of manipulating emotion and opinion. On the other hand, the philosophers who began to emerge in the 6th century BCE combined the poetry of the bards with the idea of written laws to write laws, in effect, for the cosmos itself, appealing both to reason, but also to sensation, and often proposing materialist explanations for cosmic phenomena. These two, then, represented a kind of fusion of speculation upon the highest things with a recognition of the mechanical powers in nature. Socrates, who died in 399 BCE, traditionally represents a watershed in Greek thought, the best tendencies of the sophists and of the early natural philosophers. He took advantage of the openness of Athenian democracy to become a public scold, demanding of his fellow citizens the effort of reflection upon their principles, rather than teaching a packaged doctrine. His refusal to clearly commit himself, however, and to explicitly choose a side in the faction-torn world of Athenian politics caused suspicion to swirl around him, and he was sentenced to death on vague charges. The widespread expectation in such cases was that the target, having lost their platform in Athenian society, would flee into exile with the help of their influential friends. But Socrates chose instead to accept his capital punishment, becoming an iconic figure and the spiritual founder of several schools of philosophy, chiefly that associated with his student Plato and his own successors. Another tribe of creative thinkers who exerted a powerful influence on Greek and later Western civilization were the playwrights. Tragedy and comedy were performance traditions forming part of the cult of the savior god Dionysus, and originally told stories strictly connected with the birth and life of the god, but began treating a wider array of content at the same time as they moved from a solo performance and chorus model to a scenic structure involving actors in separate roles. At a certain point, it became a proverbial criticism that many plays had, quote, nothing to do with Dionysus. The idea of the independence and inherent dignity of the fine arts, however, which was also grounded in the cult of the Musae, or Muses, the leader of whom was Apollo, the god of prophecy and of truth, was to prove an integral theme in the self-understanding of the West, and indeed is not at all alien to Dionysiac salvific theology. The arts could not be accorded such value, however, without also being subjected to standards of rational criticism, and the discourse of aesthetics grew up alongside the arts, which came to include the novel as a genre distinct from epic poetry in the Hellenistic and late antiquity. The novel's reemergence in the modern era, along with the extraordinary proliferation of secular narrative performance in traditional and new media, were integral in fashioning characteristically Western identities. The visual arts, architecture, mathematics, and the sciences as well have played an outstanding role in this process. And always, we might say, when they have displayed the most independence from cultural canons in order to seek out their own immanent principles and their own unique relationships to nature or materiality. Western identity is consistently most integral when most decentered in this fashion, despite the inevitable tensions that generates. The next stage in the emergence of the Western paradigm came with the establishment of multicultural empires by the Macedonians, a Hellenized people from the northern reaches of the Aegean Peninsula under Alexander the Great, and then by the Romans, themselves rather Hellenized by the time that they transformed their republic into an empire under Augustus. In the Eastern Mediterranean, and in the territories lying further east, to the degree that any Western power was a factor there, the international language was Greek, even after the Hellenistic Empire won by Alexander had been incorporated into the Roman Empire. And long after the Roman Empire had fallen in the West, it continued in the East as a Greek-speaking empire, to which we generally refer as Byzantium. Latin had virtually no presence east of the Adriatic, and indeed even the southern part of the Italian peninsula was predominantly Greek-speaking throughout antiquity and for quite some time thereafter. Latin would have its day as the international language of what we call the West later, when the latter's center of gravity had shifted in the so-called Middle Ages. All of these denominations are intensely ideological, of course. There was no reason whatsoever for anyone living in the eastern part of the empire to think of the successor states to Rome in the West as representing any civilization worthy of the name for 1,000 years. And the Eastern European and Slavic successor states continue to contest with the Western European and Anglo-American powers the mantle of Western civilization, in the name, to some extent, of that Eastern Empire. There's no point in obfuscating, however, that insofar as the concept of Western civilization is the ideological product of geopolitical power acquired by Western European and Anglo-American states during the era of modernity, it applies to the successor states of the Western and not those of the Eastern Empire. Indeed, it applies to the latter to virtually the same degree that it applies to the Islamic world, which is nearly as much of an inheritor of Western civilization, having received both Greek philosophy and the Christian appropriation of Judaism, according to the construct of Athens and Jerusalem as twin poles, an ideological framework first explicitly articulated by the Christian Tertullian in the 3rd century CE, for whom, however, it was an axis of conflict and not of harmony. It's not surprising, indeed, that the conflictual nature of the Western project, which begins with the centuries-long struggle between Christianity and the polytheist traditions to wrest from the latter the fruits of the civilization that they had created, should have continued and become endemic and even defining, such that the notion of a true West, albeit continuously mobile and constantly contested, is now an essential element of Western ideology. Hegel, an iconic modern Western thinker, makes conflict and contradiction essential to his system of absolute idealism, which proposes to encompass all phenomena, both ideal and worldly. And his thinking was operationalized in a materialist form by another iconic Western thinker, Marx. Hegel drew inspiration in this from Heraclitus, one of the great pre-Socratic philosophers, who stated that conflict, or war, polemos, is the father of all and the king of all. This conception of a conflictual unity is indispensable to the Western self-understanding, because it can unify even and especially what most vigorously resists unification. All of the most sophisticated and influential expressions of Western thought, we may say, place this tension at their center in some fashion. In the period covered by the first half of this course, however, the project of reason, which had begun in the West as a thoroughly non-dogmatic exercise, was successfully transformed by Christianity into the servant of a creed narrower and more exclusionary than any that had existed before. Whether this was in fact accomplished through brute force, silencing opposing voices, does not ultimately matter insofar as the entire subsequent project of Western rationality has been to justify it, if not as what was right, then as what was inevitable. One of the basic challenges of this course, therefore, is to challenge this narrative, while at the same time recognizing that epical transformations, such as the imposition of monotheist hegemony in the West, never occur as a result of merely contingent factors either. We must grasp directly the paradox of the unprecedented mobility and mutability of identity in the West, with its liberatory potential, combined with the West's equally unprecedented use of coercion to impose assimilation and punish deviancy. We must simultaneously be able to recognize the value in the ideals of Western civilization and understand how those same principles contributed to terrifying loss of life and possibly irrevocable damage to our global habitat. That the good and the evil in Western civilization do not come from fundamentally different sources. Accordingly, we must begin not with any of the infancy narratives that the West has framed for itself, but with the circumstances in which the ideas and forms of selfhood characteristic of the West up to this present moment emerge. Our course begins, therefore, from archaic Greece, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Bronze Age palace cultures of the Aegean, with a culture involved not in creating a new world, but reweaving a social fabric which had been irreparably torn. I invite you to join us on this journey and to help with your participation to shape where it goes from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. That was super powerful, at least personally to me, and I'm sure that the audience members who heard you speak would have received a lot of points for reflection. Generally, these days, we even look at ourselves from the Western perspective. We just take whatever the West thinks of us and we believe it to be true without even putting a second thought. So the opportunity of us understanding the West's understanding of itself would offer a lot of opening of minds and a lot of perspectives that would definitely help. I think we have a okay, Sumedha Chaturvedi ji, namaskar. We invite the audience members to put forth any questions that they may have about the course, the content per se, how it's run, anything, any question or any observations also. The idea is to have an interactive space, at least for this 1 hour. So please feel free to come forth. Oh, we have something. I will be posting a link of the course in case any one of you is interested in the program, or if you know of like-minded learners who might want to enroll into it. So here is the link to register. I am putting it in the chat box. You can either type your questions in the Q&A box, or you could even raise your hand and we could unmute you and you could directly ask your question. So Betaji, very good input. I have just posted the link in the chat and I'm posting it again in response to your query. The course is conducted on our learning portal, and Dr. Butler comes every week on Saturday. And a recording of the course is made, of the live session is made available within 72 hours of any session. And any readings shared by Dr. Butler is also uploaded there. We have a discussion forum on the learning portal, wherein the participants, whether they join the session live or participate asynchronously, can put forth their comments, observations, queries, and Dr. Butler participates there itself. And there is a certificate of participation, of course, towards the end, provided, all the stipulations are met with. So yes, we have some other. Dr. Butler, this is a question for you by one anonymous attendee.
Yes, I see. Would the course also include a discussion about how Western views on international relations and the nation-state system evolved? Yes, absolutely. One of the things that I'm striving to do in this course is to present as broad-based a view as possible of what we call Western civilization or Western identity that incorporates philosophy. And I tend to give a particularly central role to philosophy because I believe that in any civilization, philosophy is where the self-understanding of a culture is forged. But also, and importantly, to include political thought, to include artistic thought and artistic production, the ways in which these sources feed into identity formation, and also economic thought, scientific thought, mathematical thought, to try to gain as synoptic a view as possible of all of these different streams that come together in Western identity formation. And certainly one of the themes that becomes very important in the early modern period in the West is the emergence of the nation-state concept, and the ways in which this interacts with a lot of the pre-existing ideologies, the way in which it interacts with Christendom and with the crisis in Christendom that comes about through the Protestant Reformation, the way in which certain ancient ideas are reactivated. And then, of course, all of this is transformed progressively as well in the 19th and in the 20th centuries with the emergence of new powers, the shifting center of gravity of power in the West. These are all crucial factors that I intend to discuss and that we will indeed be dealing with. And people who enroll in the course can bring their own interest and help to shape the direction in which it goes through their input, through the questions that they ask, and through the concerns that they bring to the table as well, which is important to point out. Let's see. Well, some very kind words, which I appreciate. But the question: do the intellectuals and philosophy professors in the West actually present the objective analysis of Western civilization expressed by you today in their classrooms? They don't in India. In most colleges, students are told that the West is the best. Well, I mean, I've tried to strike a balance in this course between using the texts that are recognized for the most part in the canon, the so-called canon of Western civilization, because I know that I'm going to bring to it a novel perspective. And so in order to balance the approach, what I try to do is to make sure that we're looking at texts that have a history of reception in the West, so that we're not rewriting the canon, we're not changing the canon of recognized texts, but I'm bringing a novel perspective to it, a perspective which is much more polycentric, to use a term that has been important in my own theoretical work, a perspective that's more polycentric to the position of the West in a global framework. And also, as I think you saw in the lecture, to emphasize the elements of pluralism and contestation, the instability, which has been essential to Western identity itself from the very beginning. And so in that sense, I come at it with a pluralistic perspective from the outside in terms of that global context of the West. But I'm also bringing that pluralism inside and recognizing the constitutive pluralism and mobility, mutability of Western identity itself, coming directly from its core texts, and not coming from some kind of external perspective, but really coming from the texts that are recognized as being central to that tradition itself.
Thank you, Dr. Butler. Do we have any other question? Yes. Thank you, Shivaramanji. We appreciate this one line of encouragement for us. Is there any other question that the audience members have, or any comment? Probably we still have few minutes left. So if any of you would like to speak up, please raise your hand. We can unmute and we could have a conversation. I have a question, Dr. Butler. So are you going to focus more on the Greek civilization, considering that the West would like to trace the entire, their whole source and origin of the Western civilization to the Greeks? Is that how the program is structured?
Yeah, well, I think that it's extremely important to have a comprehensive grounding in the ancient sources of the Western tradition, because if one doesn't, then I think that you lack the context for a great deal of what's said later on. And so although the course is structured in a balanced fashion, covering the ancient, the medieval, the Renaissance, the early modern, and the high modern era, as well as our own, as it's been termed, postmodern era, although it's structured in that fashion, I think that it is extremely important, and I do emphasize the importance of getting right that understanding of antiquity, because I think that subsequent thinkers at each stage of the tradition are standing on the shoulders of those who came before and often internalizing the readings and interpretations of those who came before that have been handed down to them. And particularly in terms of understanding how that interpretation has evolved and changed. Because we need to have an independent perspective on the earlier stages of the tradition, understanding for ourselves what's going on there, in order to understand how the evolving interpretation of those sources then operates throughout the rest of the tradition. And of course, because I'm particularly a specialist in ancient Greek thought, it's sort of inevitable.
Yes.
But I will stress that I'm very much comfortable with modern thought as well. If people know anything about the institution that I come out of, the New School for Social Research, it's very much known for modern thought. And in some ways, I was an oddity there, being so engaged with ancient thought, and had to learn a great deal of the modern European tradition as well. So it's actually one of the things that's exciting about this course for me is the chance to teach a lot of modern thinkers who I've been reading for a long time, but who I've never had the opportunity to teach before. And so that's one of the exciting things about the course for me, and to try to draw together and present the kind of unified understanding of this tradition that I've developed for myself over the years, but which I haven't had an opportunity to really deal with in my own work.
True. And at the cost of sounding immodest, this is like a global first kind of a course, be it online or offline. I haven't chanced upon such a course, because you yourself said that you don't get such opportunities per se. I have one quick question before we go on to the Q&A box. Is it necessary for the participants or learners who wish to enroll to have a humanities or arts or that kind of social sciences background, or can anybody with any kind of academic background enroll?
No, it's absolutely not necessary to have that kind of background. And I mean, I think that it's actually very useful to have people bringing different kinds of interests to the table, interests in the arts, interests in math and the sciences. I think that that's actually extremely important, because, as I said earlier, because of the importance that these have had in the formation of Western identity, all of these fields, all of these arts, you see in the lecture that I gave, the emphasis in the quote from Galen on applying oneself to the arts and crafts. And this emphasis in Western thought right from the beginning, it's been very important, and it's one of the themes that I really emphasize. And so, by the same token, when the students bring their own interests in these fields to the table, it enriches the whole approach, and it actually helps to guide the course in the direction that I want to take it anyway.
Thank you. There's one question or comment rather by Mr. Anjan Nandi. If you could have a look at it.
It's interesting. It's the question about architectural practice. The influence and elements of Western architecture are visible in Eastern countries, whereas Eastern influence on Western are not. Well, this is quite interesting. I mean, we can see that the Greek tradition in architecture actually derives itself originally from Egypt. And we can see this by the use of columns and the distinctive architectural layout of temples. The application of mathematical principles to architecture was also very important in the formulation of the earliest Greek philosophy. And so when then we get the transmission of certain Western architectural forms east in the wake of Alexander's conquests, what we're actually getting is Hellenic civilization, Greek civilization, operating not in a hegemonic way, but actually as a kind of interstitial tissue between different civilizations, and actually spreading elements from one another to each other, disseminating them throughout this space. And so initially, in a way, it's this kind of interstitial space. We may think of these architectural forms now as being distinctively and hegemonically Western. But one of the things that's important to understand is the way in which that actually comes about through the synthesis of disparate elements in the first place.
So, which also gives me a nice segue that on Indica courses, we offer, as I did say, courses across various themes, various subjects, various fields of knowledge. And recently, we offered a course on Introduction to Vastu by the super brilliant Ms. Tashikalaji. It's just recently concluded. You might have a look on the course page to get an idea of what it was. If you go to indica.courses, and should any of you be interested in that, you can just express your interest and we'll make sure that we get back to you when the course is offered again. I mention it not just to promote, of course, I am promoting Being the Servant Leader at Indica courses, but the fact that this question, this kind of question and an entire conversation definitely was a part of the Vastu course. So, I'm glad that most of you are here. Obviously, the webinar theme interested you, but I would really encourage you to have a look, check out indica.courses and see if there is something else that also resonates with you. We are reaching 6:58 p.m. If there is any quick question towards the end, or a comment or any observation from the audience, and Dr. Butler, if there's something else you would like to say as we conclude, perhaps we could use the remaining few minutes for that.
Well, I would just like to, again, I'd like to thank everyone from Indica and from Indica courses specifically for all their hard work to make this platform as good a place to teach as it is. And I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us synchronously, and all of those who are going to be watching this later. One of the things that I very much try to do in the course is to constantly have in mind both the synchronous and the asynchronous attendees and participants, and to really make a distinctive learning experience that has a foot in both camps and isn't exclusively for the people who are there live, but is also there for this broader audience, this broader reception. And I just would like to encourage people to consider joining us and enriching the experience for everyone by their participation.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much. I would like to re-emphasize that Dr. Butler, in fact, is one of the more thoughtful faculties who try to create a seamless, similar experience for both who can join the live sessions and the participants who join us asynchronously. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that we understand that people from across the globe are interested in the courses, and in order to ensure that they can manage the time zone differences. In fact, Dr. Butler woke up very early today to attend this webinar, and he also conducts his session early in the morning, though it's late in the night for us. So that's how we kind of are inclusive, collaborate, make sure that we look at the constraints and optimize those to ensure that a great, meaningful learning experience is provided. Thank you so much, Dr. Butler, and thank you to all the audience members who joined today. Thank you, Nandiji. And we look forward to your participation in future overview webinars. Should you have any queries about this particular course or any other course on Indica Courses portal, please feel free to email us at reachout@indica.courses, and we shall get in touch with you in real time, or as near real time as possible. Thank you, Dr. Butler. Thank you, audience. Thank you, Koti ji, and all my colleagues from Indica and Indica Courses for helping us create this particular learning space. Thank you, and we'll see you soon again. Namaste.